If you'll take your Bible and open to the book of Obadiah, we're working our way through the minor prophets, and we're starting with what might be the first minor prophet, the first book that was written. And it's definitely, whether or not it's the first book, it's definitely the shortest. Obadiah is a very, very short book, and it has to do with God's promise to Israel. Will God keep his promise when it looks like he's not? It has to do with something we call the day of the Lord. Theme of Obadiah, God as vengeful judge. God will glorify himself and save his people by judging their enemies. And he will even use moments where it looks like he's not keeping his promise to keep his promise. God's always working on his plan, and he will accomplish his plan. So if you'll take your Bible, if you haven't already, and open to Obadiah, we'll work our way through this book just verse by verse. It starts with a very short introduction, one of the shorter introductions in the prophets, but that makes sense because it's a short book in the prophets. And it just starts the vision or a vision of Obadiah. And obviously that's telling us what kind of book this is and who wrote this book. It's a vision of Obadiah. Vision means supernatural dream, a supernatural sight, you might say. It's not the word for seen, but actually literally the word for revelation. This is a revelation from God to Obadiah. And Obadiah literally means servant of Yahweh. It's a title for a prophet. So a vision to a servant of Yahweh. Very generic, I suppose. This is revelation from God to a prophet of God. And it begins, thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. Now, he's probably not speaking directly to Edom. There's war and devastation instead in Israel, and Obadiah is looking at what Edom has done to Israel and saying, this is what is coming. He is establishing the existence of hope. Doesn't give all the nitty-gritty details of how that hope is going to work out, but basically Obadiah says there will be a day when justice is served and there is no way for the enemies of God like Edom to avoid it. After introducing the book, he announces the coming judgment in 1b through 10. And what does he say they've heard? We've heard a report, and he's talking about a physical report. And he says, there's a report, we need to move because we're going to battle. And so Israel hears this human announcement, and Obadiah is going to show us what is going on behind that human announcement about battle. What does God say he's going to do to Edom in verse 2? He says two things he's going to do to Edom. He's going to make you small among the nations. Behold, I will make you small among the nations, and you shall be utterly despised. In other words, God is announcing he is going to humiliate Edom. And what's the reason for their humiliation, according to verses 3 and 4? Pride. Pride comes before a fall. You have lived in the clefts of the rock, he says. They were so proud, Edom, of their fortified cities. The Edomites lived in the mountainous region of the Arabah with elevations up to 5,000 feet above sea level, and their inaccessible location gave them false hopes of security. And as a result, Obadiah said that pride fooled them into a false sense of invulnerability. What do they say in their heart at the end of verse 3? Who will bring me to the ground? It's almost as if they're boasting. There's no one that can destroy us. And God says that it's not going to be any problem for him to bring them to the ground in verse 4. He says, though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is in the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. Who will bring you to the ground? I will bring you to the ground. What does that tell you about God? It tells you that God is king, and that no one, no matter how proud they are, no matter how invulnerable they think they are, no one can stand against God. More specifically, we see in verse 5 that their destruction is going to be total. Obadiah is talking to Israel about Edom, and it looks like Edom is winning, and God has forgotten his promises. And Obadiah says, let me tell you what actually is going to happen is that God is going to humble Edom. And He's going to judge them, and he's going to destroy them, and their destruction is going to be total. And he begins with an illustration. What's the illustration? He says, if thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, and then he adds a side comment. He says, how you have been destroyed. He's a poet. Now back to the illustration. What does he say thieves would have done? And then he gives another illustration of grape gatherers. What would grape gatherers have done? He says that thieves would have only stolen enough for themselves. They wouldn't have taken absolutely everything. And even grape gatherers, they wouldn't have taken all the grapes. They would have left some gleanings. But that's not what's going to happen to Edom. And the idea is that after this judgment, they're going to look back, and it would have been better to have your house broken into in the middle of the night, because thieves would have been more merciful. There's going to be nothing left for Edom. How Esau has been pillaged, Obadiah says, his treasures sought out. And that's significant because he calls Edom Esau. Why? Because this isn't just about two nations. It's about Jacob and Esau. It goes all the way back. Now, look at how it has happened in verse 7. What have Edom's allies done? He says, they have turned on them. All your allies have turned on you. They've driven you to your border. Those at peace with you have deceived you. They have prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set a trap beneath you. You have no understanding. And basically, Obadiah is saying, you thought you made a covenant with these people, but they tricked you. They aren't just going to refuse your refugees like you did to us. Men of peace will make war. You thought you were at peace, but it's going to be your friends that actually set a trap for you. Which, of course, again, is ironic, because that's exactly what Edom had done to Israel. And as we read the prophets, we're going to see this time and time again, that God's judgment is really just. It's not too much. It's exactly fair. He portions out his judgment, you might say, to really fit the circumstances. Edom had broken their covenant. They had turned their back on their relationship with their brother, and they had deceived them. And as a result, God's going to do the same to Edom. In verses 8 and 9, we see they're going to experience all kinds of internal domestic problems as a result. What is God going to destroy? Who is God going to dismay? What does that mean for Edom? He says, will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy the wise men out of Edom and the understanding out of Mount Esau? And your mighty men shall be dismayed, O Teman, so that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter. God's saying he's going to destroy all kinds of wisdom. Edom will no longer have any intelligence. They will no longer be known for any insight or knowledge. People are going to look at them and say, that's a dumb nation. The wisdom will be gone, and all the powerful men will be gone, and they'll be ashamed and cut off forever. Verse 10. And the reason for this judgment is the violence done to Jacob, and the result will be that they are shamed and cut off, which goes back up to verse 2. God said, I'm going to make you small, and I'm going to make you utterly despised. This is how I'm going to do it, and you're not going to be able to stop it. Even though you're so proud, you think no one can bring you down, I will bring you down. And this is a judgment really by slaughter. They're like cattle. They're going to be brutally killed. This passage is a little bit like a father who takes on the bully who has been beating up his children. And it all connects back to the Abrahamic covenant. Those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And God's going to orchestrate all of history to accomplish that judgment. Some people think this happened in the 500s. Other people think it happened in 70 AD. But either way, these are just steps along the way, because we know ultimately when the fulfillment of this prophecy is going to happen. Obadiah tells us in verses 15 and following, this is going to happen on the great day of the Lord. He announces the coming judgment in verses 1 through 9, and then he goes on to explain when and how it's going to happen in verses 10 through 18. And he begins in verses 10 through 14 by once again reminding them why they are being judged. What is the reason he gives in verse 10? He says, because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. This goes all the way back to the fundamental issue between Jacob and Esau. And in verse 11 he continues. What does he say they did? On that day you stood aloof. On the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. They didn't get involved as enemies of Israel carried off their wealth. They just watched. This is, you might say, a sin of omission. And it happened at a specific time in Israel's history. They were gloating over Israel's misfortune and rejoicing in Judah's ruin. And they're boasting in their brother's troubles, really. They try to take advantage of Israel for their own good. It's not that they so much carried off Israel's wealth themselves, but they watched as others did. And it's kind of like Obadiah is looking back at what happened and looking forward at the same time, which is what happens so often in the prophets. He considers how Edom acted in the past, and he sees there's going to be a day in the future when they treat Israel like this as well, and they're going to be punished for it. What do they do in verses 12 through 14? They gloat over Israel's disaster. They end up taking advantage of Israel. They find ways, when Israel runs to them for refuge, they actually find ways to make money off of Israel by handing them over to their enemies to be enslaved. And this illustrates really the wickedness of man. This is brother against brother. They're actually rejoicing when their brothers are killed. They're actually killing the fugitives and enslaving the fugitives who are fleeing for their lives. And so Obadiah is saying God's justice is deserved. You did this to yourself. Now Obadiah begins to describe exactly how they're going to be judged in verses 15 through 18. And really what's happening here is Obadiah is taking what's going to happen to Edom and he's going to make it one step bigger. And it's going to illustrate what's going to happen to all of God's enemies. What's he say is near in verse 15? And who's it near for? He says, for the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. And that phrase, day of the Lord, is going to be really important in this whole series on the minor prophets. And we're going to talk about it more, especially when we come to the book of Joel. But for now, we can define the day of the Lord as a term for events that especially vindicate God's character and God's purpose. It's the day that belongs to God, the day that God reveals really who he is. And here we see, he says, the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. It seems like he's moving past the judgment that's coming on Edom. And here he's talking to all the enemies of God's people. And here's the judgment. He says, as you've done it, shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your head. In other words, there's a correspondence between their deeds and what happens to them. Specifically, for as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually. They shall drink and swallow and shall be as though they had never been. And the you here is a you all. What does it mean that they've drunk on his holy mountain? They had been judged, and the nations would be judged in a similar way. He says all the nations will drink continually, which is a picture of continually experiencing God's wrath. So if we take a step back, what's happening in Obadiah? At a particular time in history, Israel's looking at their situation and saying, God, you haven't kept your promise. Look at what Edom is doing. And God's saying, no, don't listen to them. Don't listen to what they're saying, and don't judge what I'm doing by appearances right now, because I haven't forgotten my promise. I will judge Edom, and bigger than that, I will judge all of my enemies. They will drink my wrath, just like you're going to see happen to Edom. But in the middle of all this judgment, there's hope. If you look at verse 17. But in Mount Zion there shall be those who escape, and it shall be holy. What is Mount Zion? It's Jerusalem. Who will be in Mount Zion? Well, God will be in Mount Zion. God will dwell in Mount Zion. And what will happen to Mount Zion? It will be restored as the residence of Yahweh, and Israel will be restored to her land. Mount Zion's going to be holy. What makes it holy? The presence of God. Said it's going to be set apart for God, Jerusalem. And Israel will be restored, and they'll receive all of their possessions back. And holiness will pervade Jerusalem. As one man writes, when the nations will be humiliated under the furious hand of God, and when their territories apparently will be desecrated, Yahweh will respond to the laments of his people, and his mountain will be set apart once more. And what will happen to Israel? The house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions. And the root of possess usually speaks of possessing land. So the land that Yahweh delivered into Israel's enemies' hands will be given back to Israel. And God's faithfulness as a result will be vindicated. He will keep every single last promise. In verse 18, Obadiah says, "The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau a stubble." And what's the picture there? Imagine a scorching field. And what's happened to Edom? What Edom did to Israel, Israel will do back to Edom. And at that moment, everyone will know God keeps his promises, because God was faithful. And the world will know what is the difference between Jacob and Esau. Esau was down, Jacob was down. Esau doesn't survive, Jacob survives. Why? The people God chooses, he'll never give up on. And he will restore, and he will keep all his promises of salvation to them. And Obadiah concludes by proclaiming the ultimate triumph of Israel in verses 19 through 21. If you look down at these verses, what he talks about here hasn't actually happened yet. The judgment against Edom produces not just judgment on Edom, but a fulfillment of what God promised to Israel. And it all connects back to them receiving the land back and God dwelling with them. Negeb refers to the region covering southern Judah and stretching into the Sinai Peninsula. Negeb literally means dry ground. It eventually referred to the Southland. This area was hard to live in, and as a result, Judah had a difficult time controlling this part of the country. Edom actually kept coming up and taking over the Negeb. Mount Esau refers to the mountainous heartland of Edom. Shephelah means lowland and was the region that was supposed to be controlled by Judah and Dan, but was often occupied by the Philistines instead. And it's a funny way of talking here. He says, those of Shephelah will possess the land of the Philistines. So he's talking about a territory dispossessing a people. The field of Ephraim reflects the tribal territory dominated by the central ridge in the landscape of Ephraim, and the field of Samaria focuses attention on the area around the capital city of the northern kingdom. And Benjamin's pictured as crossing the Jordan and claiming the territory of Gilead, which refers to the hill country of the Transjordan on both sides of the river Jabbok. And essentially the point is the exiles are coming back, and they're going to get the land. And Obadiah he ends by talking about these saviors who are going to go up Mount Zion. Verse 21, saviors shall go up to Mount Zion to rule Mount Esau. And who are the saviors? They are persons who have been rescued themselves from desperate circumstances. Those, one man says, who have been victims of enemy invaders but were brought back by Yahweh will go on the offensive, and they will reclaim the most important stronghold in the land. They will rule Mount Esau, and Esau is representative really of all the nations. To Obadiah, the sons of Esau represented more than just this minor nation or even the relatives of the Israelites. In the end, they function as a representative of all the nations who have lined up with the seed of the serpent against the seed of the woman, against God's people. And so this is the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and to his people. Israel will be exalted. Their enemies, those who curse them, those who fight against them, they will be destroyed. And what does Obadiah say about the kingdom at the very end? It says, the kingdom shall be the Lord's. And there's a definite article there, the kingdom. There's going to be one kingdom, and God's going to enable Israel to rescue the land, you might say, to go up Mount Zion and rule over Mount Esau. But at the end of the day, it's God's kingdom. They are God's people, and the rule will be Yahweh's. So here are God's people, Obadiah, looking at their circumstances and thinking God's forgotten his promises and things are out of control. And God gives a revelation to a prophet who comes to God's people and says, actually, it's just the opposite. God is ruling over his kingdom, even when it looks like he's not. The final statement of this book is very significant. If you don't remember anything, remember this. The dominion will belong to Yahweh. And what does that mean exactly? When you think of a kingdom, you think place and people, but this word doesn't really mean that. At least that's not the emphasis of this word. It involves that, but it's not the emphasis. The emphasis is on the king's dominion. And this place and people reflect that. The point of the last statement in Obadiah is that God will be exalted as king when he crushes Edom and all of his enemies. He will have a kingdom, and it will be the entire planet, and the entire cosmos. But when God says through Obadiah, the kingdom is the Lord's, he's saying this is a clear evidence that God is in charge of this world. Everyone will know God really is in charge of this world. Israel will finally realize God's in charge. The end of the statement of the book is not feel better, guys, because Edom's going to get theirs. No, the end of this book is really saying, Israel, you have to understand, I am not going to forget my promise because I am using you. I'm jealous for my glory, and I'm using you to prove that I am king. Israel is going to be taught that their suffering at this moment is part of a chain of events that fits into God's plan that extends all the way into the end times, so that the entire world will know that God rules all. And that's why Jacob versus Esau. That's why this is going on. Why God chooses some and judges others. It's about his glory, and it's about the resolution of a promise. God is going to keep the promise he made to Jacob because he's faithful. He's made a choice, and that choice is going to prove effective. And the different destinies of these two nations demonstrates that it's not about us and about what we can accomplish. If it was about us and what we can accomplish, we'd both be Esau. And the result's going to be at the end when we see God's people saved. We're going to say we know it must be God who saved them. It's God's choice. God has this plan. God has this authority. God has this power, and God is able to accomplish exactly what he says he will accomplish, when he wants to accomplish it, the way he wants to accomplish it. Because he really is king. That's basically, in short, the message of Obadiah.